a healthy diet. Now, that is not the only deprivation. You can see here that people around the world are suffering many other severe deprivations and do so in very large numbers. 2 billion people lack access to essential medicines. Similar numbers lack access to safe drinking water, to adequate shelter. 750 million lack access to electricity. 3.4 billion lack adequate sanitation. 781 million adults are illiterate, and some 140 million children between the ages of 5 and 17 do wage work outside the household. These numbers, as far as possible, are from the year 2021. I tried to get the latest numbers. So what you can see here is that at least half of humankind are still suffering one or more of these very severe deprivations that make it very hard to lead a worthwhile life. Now, the reason for that is not that the world is too poor in aggregate. The reason for that is inequality, as you can see on the next slide. The average income in 2024 was about 64 international dollars per person per day. International dollars are dollars converted at purchasing power parity. That is about 5 times higher, the per capita income, than it was at the end of World War II. So very significant progress has been made at the aggregate level, but that progress has not trickled down to the poor. The poor have not participated proportionately in global economic growth. They are not 5 times richer than the poor were in 1945 or 1948. And so they've been left behind, and many of them still live below that $5 per day PPP, purchasing power parity level, that would be sufficient for people to be able to afford a healthy diet. This inequality, next slide, is highly correlated with historical injustice. So the former colonies that have been brutally exploited during a colonial period, and also in the immediate aftermath of that period, are still very far, lagging very far behind the rich countries. You see here in this diagram the world population divided into 2 groups, the core group being the developed countries of Western Europe, the US, and Australia, New Zealand, and so on, Japan, and then the periphery, the countries that are mostly former colonies. China is missing from this distribution here. And the difference in median income between the core and the periphery, if you take the median person in each of those 2 groups, the ratio is 22.6. So the median person in the core is 22.6 richer than the median person in the periphery. And that, of course, is an incredible inequality, very, very large inequality, which really helps explain, or at least put into context, the fact that so many people still suffer such severe poverty despite the high global average income. Now, what you often hear is that things are rapidly getting better, but the next slide shows that at least since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, things have gone backwards quite dramatically. I think the Sustainable Development Goals, their adoption has something to do with that people said, oh, we have adopted these wonderful SDGs, and now we can relax. We don't have to do anything further. We have committed ourselves to wonderful things on paper. The deadline for that is 2030. Let the people in the second half of the 2020s worry about these goals, and we can, for the moment, relax. So what you see here is how the number of moderately or severely food insecure people developed, it went up by roughly one half in the period since 2015. And what you can also see is that this increase did not come through COVID and through the Russia-Ukraine war, but it started much earlier. There was a dramatic increase between 2015 and 2019, well before those two events happened. So there really is a tremendous amount of backsliding. The world got richer in aggregate, but the number of poor people increased quite dramatically. So what I want to say in summary is that the world poverty problem as we see it today is both surprisingly large and also surprisingly small. It is surprisingly large in human terms, in that more than half of all human beings still suffer from one or more severe poverty-related deprivations. It is surprisingly small in economic terms, in that the poor are a minuscule fraction of global income, and doubling their income or trebling their income would be entirely possible at very little cost, even to just the richest 1% of humankind. So never has poverty been as easily and cheaply avoidable as now. And so it's a great indictment of our generation that we are simply letting it continue. Now let's go to the explanation. The one important part of the explanation for the persistence of poverty, and more generally for the exclusion of morality from international affairs, is the idea that we are in a competitive environment, in a kind of jungle environment. Governments and corporations that could easily eradicate poverty and the associated deprivations present themselves as locked in a fierce and ultimately unlimited competition with each other. And in this competition, they say, morality becomes aspirational. We must disregard even our own deepest values for the sake of protecting our and those values' long-term survival and influence. So we are in this competitive situation. We must survive. And exactly because we care deeply about our moral values, we must disregard them for the moment so that we can survive and prevail, and then maybe implement those values later on. But for the moment, in this fiercely competitive international environment, unfortunately, we cannot afford to constrain our competitive behavior by moral rules or constraints. Now, to put this into a larger context, you might say there are three different kinds of world that we might distinguish. There is a world without rules, a kind of Hobbesian world of everyone against everyone. There is a morally based order, which would be modeled roughly on what we already have within nation states today, and also in the context of the European Union, for example, a kind of morally based world order where the commitment to the is moral. And then we have a strange intermediate category, which we can call a modus vivendi, which is based on prudence. We do have rules, and we, of course, have an enormous number of rules at the international level, but these rules are being complied with for prudential reasons. So states and other actors play by the rules insofar as they do, because they find that to be in their own best interest. So this is a kind of organized, regularized jungle, but it is still, as we will see, a jungle. A modus vivendi is a decentralized order based on prudence, where the shared rules persist if and only so long as all parties are known to have sufficient prudential reasons for compliance. So I trust in the compliance of others because I understand that it is in their best interest to comply. If it is no longer in their best interest, I understand that they will defect, they will no longer comply, and may renegotiate the rules in order to restore the compliance condition. Now, a party's prudential reasons depend primarily on the distribution of power. So whether I have a reason to accept certain rules depends on my threat potential, what harm can I do to others, and how vulnerable am I to being harmed by others. A modus vivendi can last through changes in power and interest. It's basically a system of rules that reflects the existing distribution of bargaining power. If that distribution of power changes, the modus vivendi can nevertheless survive because its rules can be adjusted to the changed distribution of power. So a strengthening party will say, let's continue the modus vivendi, but let me have more favorable rules. And weakening parties will accept that. They will make concessions because it's better for them that the modus vivendi continues than that we collapse into an all-out war of all against all. So the great strength, the great advantage of a modus vivendi is that it provides stability over time. It can last through time, through changes in the distribution of power. It is a flexible equilibrium where the rules are at any time adjusted to the shifting distribution of power. So as India becomes more powerful in the world, it can negotiate better terms of its collaboration with other countries. But on the downside, there is the risk of spirals. And spirals happen as follows. When a party becomes weaker, it will need to make concessions. It will need to accept less favorable terms. And these less favorable terms may then weaken this party even further. And so there is the real possibility of particular states becoming weaker and weaker. They become weaker for a while, then the terms of international collaboration are changed against them to their disadvantage. Then they become weaker still as a consequence of that. And so finally, a state can completely disappear from the stage simply because it was caught in one of these downside spirals. Russia is a very good example of that. Russia became weaker, was then forced to accept less favorable conditions. For example, that the erstwhile agreement not to expand NATO toward the east was reneged on by the Western powers. And so Russia saw itself as being increasingly marginalized. And what can then happen with such a country caught in a downward spiral is that it says it's better for us to fight now than to wait until we are ever more marginalized and displaced from center stage. So spirals are dangerous, and a modus vivendi is really not as stable as it might at first appear, because countries that are afraid of finding themselves in a spiral will often fight rather than accept increasing marginalization. So a modus vivendi under a veneer of civility is an all-out power struggle that ultimately is unlimited. Whatever the rules say at a particular time, they do not provide lasting protection because the rules can always be renegotiated or broken. If a party becomes stronger, it will just say, screw the rules. Yeah, we agreed to that 2 or 3 years ago or 2 or 3 decades ago, but now the situation situation has changed, and now we will no longer accept this rule because we have become stronger and we don't need to. Now, in such a modus vivendi, each party must prioritize its own survival and power, also known as national security, over all else. And that, as I said at the beginning, is very welcome to the stronger states and also to the large corporations that use the stronger states as tools in their struggle for wealth and power. It's very welcome because it gives you an excuse and a justification for sidelining morality. You can say, we are living in a world which is ultimately dangerous. It's a jungle. And in such a world, we cannot afford to act morally. So even very fundamental, very elementary moral rules are ones that we have to hold ourselves ready to break in the interest of surviving, naked survival. And if we don't survive, then our values will not survive either. So we really owe it to our values, our morality, that we do not allow that morality to constrain us, but rather violate it as needed in order to prevail. So in a modus vivendi, there is then no trust. There are no mutually beneficial, reliable agreements, agreements that you can really seriously count on to last. And even genuinely moral actors must then disregard their own values, truth, human rights, democracy, whatever, in order to protect the long-term survival and influence of those values. And importantly, this sort of relaxation of morality applies even domestically, because a state, the first responsibility of any state is to prevail, is to protect itself in existence, to protect its power position. And for this power position, the consent, the support of its domestic population is crucially important. If a state doesn't have strong support domestically, then it is less able to project power internationally. And so it becomes a national security issue for a state to mobilize domestic support. And here again, you feel that you can do that, yet that you must do that in a way that violates all moral rules. So if we need to lie, if we need to jail dissidents in our country, or whatever else we need to do domestically in order to make ourselves stronger on the international stage, well, we have to do it, immoral as it may be, in order to protect ourselves and the interests of our state, to prevail, to survive in this dangerous, unstable, modus vivendi world. Good. We are coming to chapter 3, which goes more deeply into the modus vivendi model by analyzing what political power is on the international stage. Political power, and this is again standard analysis as you find them in the Anglo-American discourse on power. Political power has three main sources: military powers, economic power, and soft power. Military and economic, I think, are obvious. Soft power is a kind of residual category that contains pretty much everything else, the charisma, the moral standing, the cultural admiration that a country enjoys. So this could be Korean pop bands, it could be nice Indian food that people like to eat around the world. So things that do not fit the military and economic category are in the soft power category. Now you will ask, what is the exchange rate? How are these three types of power related to each other? And here, of course, it's important that there are no fixed exchange rates. How important a particular type of power is depends on the geopolitical environment. I'll quickly run and get some water. So how important these three sources of power are depends on the geopolitical climate. And that means that, of course, military power is important in a situation where the world is at war or close to war. And military power can be quite unimportant in a context where the world is at peace and war seems remote. So currently, in the context of the European Union, for example, military power is not particularly important for how important the European states are relative to each other. But that could change if military power again becomes more important through a warlike situation or increased belligerence. Now, this shows that various parties have diverse interests in regard to the geopolitical climate. And this can best be explained with the concept of comparative advantage. So if a country, if a state has more military power, is more competitive in terms of military power than in terms of economic power, then it will benefit from heightened tension and hostility. Conversely, if a state has more economic power, is sort of doing better in the dimension of economic power than in the dimension of military power, then its power, overall political power, will shrink if the world becomes more belligerent, more tense, more hostile. And so different states have different interests with regard to the geopolitical situation, depending on where their comparative advantage lies. In the moment, of course, you can say that the US has maybe 50% of all military power in the world and only 16% of all economic power in the world. And so for the US, it's very clear that its comparative advantage lies in military power. And that means that the US is interested in keeping the world not at war, but at least close to war, so that its military power will have a lot of weight. Now, just as different states have different interests with regard to the geopolitical climate, so different parties within states also have different interests in regard to that. So in a situation of high tension and hostility, the security services, secret services will become more powerful, and the executive will become more powerful. Conversely, in a peaceful environment, other branches of government will gain in power. And so again, there are diverse interests with regard to the geopolitical climate. Now, it is a mathematical necessity, if you like, that there must always be states that are more competitive militarily than economically or soft power-wise. This is simply the mathematics of comparative advantage. And there must always be domestic officers and groups whose power within their state increases with rising tension among states. This is simply due to the fact that power is zero-sum. And here it is worth highlighting the special role of the US president. The US president ex officio benefits doubly from increasing tension and hostility in the world. He, or hopefully soon she, benefits on the one hand because this increases her power within the United States, and also it increases the power of the United States in international affairs, because the United States has a much larger share of global military power than of global economic and soft power. Now, this, of course, is just the current situation that the US is in that position, but there must always be states that are in that position where they have, relatively speaking, more military power than economic power. Now, states in this sort of context have choices about investing their resources. A state can allocate resources among the three components of political power, but they can also allocate resources toward affecting the geopolitical climate so as to enhance the overall power they derive from their particular constellation of positions in the three hierarchies. So the US, for example, can invest in making the world more belligerent in order thereby to improve its power position because of its comparative advantage in military strength. And conversely, China or India might invest in making the world more peaceful in order thereby to improve their power position in the world. Now, here's an unfortunate asymmetry in this regard, namely that a climate of tension, hostility, crisis, and conflict is much easier to create and to maintain than it is to end or to avoid. And therefore, among prudent power seekers, violence is an ever-present option or danger. There will always be states that benefit from heightened tension, and these states will almost always find ways to get their way, to successfully keep the world at a high level of tension and hostility. This, of course, makes the world unsafe, especially as weapons of mass destruction become ever more widespread and ever more destructive, and ever more quickly deployable through the use of AI, as we recently saw in the attacks on Gaza, on Iran, on Lebanon. So we are living in a world that is quite dangerous, and in which having this high tension that a modus vivendi predicts is really likely to lead sooner or later to a major outbreak of war, major catastrophe. But it does provide this existential sort of imperative to states. We must disregard morality. We must focus on the pursuit of power at the expense of everything else. We must thrive for the dominance of ourselves and our values, if we can, in order to defend these values and preserve these values. And we must always disregard morality. We cannot afford to compete in this very dangerous world with one hand tied behind our backs. So let me refine this picture in two more ways. One is that the power that we have depends not only on our military capabilities and economic capabilities, but it also depends on what we are, you might say, willing to do. So you may remember the Vietnam War, where Mao Zedong said that the Americans were a paper tiger. And what he meant by that was they have all sorts of wonderful equipment, equipment, they are militarily very strong, but in the end, their political will to fight will run out. They will not be able to mobilize the support of their population, and so they will not be willing to go all the way to win in Vietnam. They could, but they won't. And this is a very important lesson that everybody has learned from the Vietnam War, that it's important not only to be able to do things, technically speaking, but also to be able to do them, politically speaking, to mobilize sufficient support from the population. So what you need to show to the world is that you can actually get away with doing things that violate international law, violate morality, are disapproved by your own population. And this is something that we see in the attack, the recent attack on Iran, which focused very heavily on civilian targets, on schools, on hospitals, on volleyball courts, and so on. And that was a quite explicit strategy to show that we are not only technologically able to strike, but we are able to strike protected targets without any outcry, without any real resistance on the part of our own population. Now, the analysis that I've given of a modus vivendi and the way in which you play in such a modus vivendi in order to maximize your power, this analysis is an analysis that is conventional. It's not my analysis. It is the analysis that people in military, what is now called the Department of War here in the United States, people in the State Department, people in the War Department are that's the kind of analysis that they do. This is how they see the world. And given that this is how they see the world really is that way. The world really is one in which very important actors are acting on the assumption of a modus vivendi and are trying to play this game. And if important actors are playing this game, then this is really the game that's being played. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. What this analysis leaves out, and what I think is also very important, a very important aspect, is that the fourth dimension of power, namely the capacity to subvert the leadership of other states, to ensure that the leaders of other states serve our interests rather than compatriot interests. This is a very important source of power that is not part of the traditional analysis, but plays an important role in the real world. The US is often engaged in regime change. It tries to take out a foreign government and put another government in. It may also do that in subtle ways, for example, by bribing the incumbents, which is, in the case of many poor countries, very easy to do, right? These leaderships in poor countries are caught between two constituents. On the one hand, their own populations who can do little to reward or punish them, and then foreign corporations and governments that can do quite a lot to reward and punish them. And so very often the course of least resistance for an African leader is to comply with the demands and wishes of foreigners rather than to serve the interests of the local population. So on this global chessboard, a very important way you exercise power is to subvert the leaders of other countries. And in this regard, the United States may be even more dominant than it is in the dimension of military strength. It is vastly more influential in this way than, for example, China, its main competitor. Now, the United States has declining economic strength. Its GNP is a shrinking part of the world gross product. But the US can compensate for that by investing more into its military. But its long-term dominance really depends on its ability to use its military and its subversion capabilities unconstrained by law, morality, or public opinion within a geopolitical context of high tension, hostility, and belligerence. This is the only strategy really that the US has, with only 4% of the world's population, only 16% of the world's gross product, to maintain itself as the dominant power that it has been since the end of World War II. We need the US for a moralization of international relations. Of course, we want this modus vivendi to end. We want a world that is based on rules that are morally committed to by states. But to achieve such a world, to make the world more like the European Union is now, we absolutely need the collaboration of the United States. And that's very difficult to get because US policies are highly influenced by money, money that is given by corporations and billionaires to incumbents, candidates, and political parties. The US political system is quite venal, very much up for sale, and the very rich parties within the US and also abroad routinely buy the power of the US government and use it as a tool to promote their ends. So that is the key obstacle to achieving a moralization of international relations, which of course means that it is very likely for this rather dangerous modus vivendi to continue, and thereby also for a kind of morality-free global politics to continue. That brings me to the next chapter, which the rich, in particular rich corporations, and to shape the rules in their own favor. They can do that, on the one hand, by capturing the US government, by buying themselves the support of, in particular, the US government, but also other governments that are the main players in rule shaping at the international level. Of course, they also benefit from the fact that morality in international affairs is heavily sidelined. So regulatory capture is a very real phenomenon, especially in the United States, where competitive systems are captured. Strong participants have opportunities and incentives to influence the rules through lobbying. Big corporations in the US often have their very best people sitting in Washington lobbying for rules rather than doing the work of the company, right? Boeing is a wonderful example. They have engineers working on aircraft design, but they have a lot of a small army of lobbyists in Washington ensuring that they get government contracts, that they get favorable regulation, and so on and so forth. Supranational rule making is no different. Corporations spend an enormous amount of money and effort on influencing international rule making, and this international rule making is actually easier to influence even than domestic rule making, because only very few agents are capable of influencing this international rule making. There's no democratic counterweight there. International negotiations are not subject to democratic oversight. There is not even transparency. So countries negotiate rules, and in the end, they announce the result, a new treaty, for example, but it remains obscure how that treaty exactly was negotiated, who argued for what, why certain countries made certain concessions, and so on. And moral restraints are, as I said sufficiently are easily dispelled by pointing out that international relations are a jungle in which we cannot afford to be restrained by morality. So supranational rules, the rules of the world financial system, the global economic system, trade, for example, these rules are shaped by the most powerful corporations and billionaires acting through governments that they are able to influence. And the most cost-effective lobbying that you can engage in is this lobbying at the supranational level, where you change the way or shape the way the world economy works. This lobbying is engaged in by the very wealthiest banks, hedge funds, corporations, industry associations, and individuals. And as I said, they do it by influencing governments, government officials, and especially the officials of the United States, which is on the one hand the softest target because money really plays an enormously outsized role in US politics. And also, of course, because the US is by far still the strongest player, the strongest influencer of international rules. Now, this leads to a direct conflict between the rules as we have them and the rules as morality would dictate them. So I cite you Article 28 from the Universal Declaration. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. So the UN Declaration of Human Rights is demanding that all international rules, that our international order be compliant with human rights, that under it human rights be fulfilled as much as possible. And of course, we have now an international order that is very, very far from fulfilling this requirement. So I have here a few slides that I can go over very quickly, basically defining what it would mean for an international order to be compliant with human rights, to reduce wars would have to be designed, would have to be shaped as much as possible, avoidable rights deficit. It would be easy, given today's scientific, technological, administrative, economic possibilities, it would be quite easy to shape our international order in such a way that human rights would be by and large fulfilled, and in particular, that these enormous human rights deficits that I showed you at the beginning would be reduced. We have an order. We have an order that massively reproduces poverty, that keeps half or slightly more than half the world's population in severe and life-threatening poverty, poverty for life, declaration for a human rights compliant international order. So even if we just demand only the fulfillment of human rights as a minimal conception of global justice, we find that our international order today violates this demand massively. Now, when we talk about the international order, then we should maybe specify what that contains. It contains institutional arrangements, uh, social and cultural practices, customs, and habits. I'm now on slide 36. The material infrastructure, such as transportation, energy, water, communications, and so on. And finally, the material environment as continually modified by our interactions with it. This is often called land use. And so the way we structure our planet and interactions on it All of that taken together could be called the global order or the international order. And that order is very far from being human rights compliant, as I said. Now, when you say that the international order is highly violative of human rights, people often say that, in fact, the remaining human rights deficits are not due to the international order at all. They are due to local factors, national factors, and that they account for the persistence of severe poverty where it persists. And the argument for that is, which you find in The Economist magazine quite often, almost every week, is that countries are organized differently, and that depending on local, national factors, poverty will disappear. Some countries, they are highly successful in development, and it will persist in other countries where, for example, mostly African countries where countries are bad organized, they're hiding under local like poverty eradication. I will quickly address this argument because it is so very common. And what I want to say about it is that, of course, there is a kernel of truth in the argument, namely that local factors matter for the evolution of poverty in a particular country or province. But it is also true that global factors matter. And you can see that as a intellectual point if you take an analogy. So when I teach a class at Yale, we are just at the end of the semester here, you will find that at the end of the semester, some students have learned a lot, other students have learned rather little. And of course, student-specific factors are involved in explaining the learning success of different students. But that by no means shows that the global factor, teacher or classroom or study materials, is irrelevant to student success. Of course, that is also relevant. And even systematic differences in student success, for example, that the students who are more interested in science do better in my classes than the students who are more interested in the humanities or something, even that could be traced to a global factor, namely to the teaching style of the teacher. So the argument that is often presented, namely, look at the great differences between, on the one hand, a few developing countries that have performed very well and other developing countries that have performed very poorly. These differences, of course, exist, but they are by no means sufficient to show that local factors are the only relevant factors for explaining the persistence of poverty where it persists. Now, let's go to slide 39. There you can see in more detail what the important global factors are that have a tremendous effect in dampening development in the poorer countries that are holding poor people back. And I don't have time, obviously, to go through all these factors in detail, but maybe I will just give you the one most important factor that is particularly interesting for India, and that is the factor of intellectual property rights, which you find there on the left in the middle. Intellectual property rights were globalized in 1995 as part of the foundation of the World Trade Organization treaty. So that treaty that founded the WTO had a annex called 1C, the so-called TRIPS agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, which required all WTO member states to institute 20-year product patents on defined innovations. And that was for India a very significant change, because India had before that time had only process patents of 7-year duration. And that is particularly significant, for example, in the pharmaceutical sector, where Indian generic companies were typically able very quickly to find a new process for making any new drug, and they could then bypass the existing patent, which protected only a process, and offer new drugs very cheaply to their own population and also to developing country populations around the world. India was, in a phrase of the time, the pharmacy of the world. It provided very cheap, highly reliable medicines all over the poor countries and ensured that poor people everywhere could participate in medical and pharmaceutical progress. All that ended when India came under the TRIPS agreement, which happened 10 years after the TRIPS agreement was signed in 2005. And that meant that India now had to enforce these 20-year product patents that protect a specific molecule and so do no longer allow generic companies to invent around the patent. That meant that new medicines became much more expensive in India, and it also meant that India could no longer supply these new medicines to sick people in other developing countries. And as a result, millions of people died. Generic companies were very much able to mass produce these new medicines against, for example, hepatitis C, like sofosbuvir, which came onto the market in 2013. Very effective drug against hepatitis C, but it reached only 7% of the global sufferers of hepatitis C because of the high price that many people in developing countries and even in developed countries could not afford. Hepatitis C is a infectious disease, and by ensuring that it would only reach a small percentage of the patient population, we gave hepatitis C a new lease on life. Hepatitis C is still very much around, it's still very much infecting people, and we could very well have eradicated it if we had made the drug available to everyone who is suffering from hepatitis C. So this is very, very hard to get software companies, the entertainment companies, the agriculture companies. They lobbied very, very hard for including the TRIPS agreement within the WTO framework, basically saying to the poor countries, if you want to become WTO members, if you want to have most favored nation status and export your products into the rich countries, then you have to make this concession. You have to accept our intellectual property rules and grant 20-year monopoly patents for innovations, which of course predominantly come from the global north. The global south has no serious chance in being competitive in the patenting game, right? Pretty much all the important patents, all the important innovations now are reached by northern innovators first, not because they are smarter, of course, but because they have the human capital and the financial capital to run big labs and to do these innovations. And then they say, okay, we have reached this innovation first. Now everybody in the world has to accept, has to give us patents and has to pay road toll for using these innovations. So hundreds of billions of dollars flow from the global south to the global north each year in recognition of these patents as licensing fees and royalties for northern innovators. And more importantly, many people in the global south are denied access through high prices to these innovations. So this is one concrete example of how rules were through the good offices of the United States and like-minded northern countries, rules were imposed on the world that are highly detrimental to poor people and are perpetuating the poverty of hundreds of millions of people, causing many of them to die prematurely. And these rules are in the interest of the important companies in the global north who heavily lobbied for them and are causing great distress in the global south. So I will leave it here and I look forward to discussion. I hope that you could follow the thing with good audio and also get to see the PowerPoint, which I'm happy to make available to anybody who wants to see it.
That was such an insightful presentation, sir. Yes. It wouldn't be wrong to say that the global elites have a way of suppressing the developing nations in the name of norms and protocols, thus keeping a monopoly over the resources. So moving ahead now, most certainly this presentation would have stirred the minds of intellectuals over here with us. So we are opening the Q&A segment and the platform is open for everyone to ask questions to Professor. You all can raise your hands or put your questions in the chat box while maintaining decorum. So, oh, I see many hands being raised. Okay, so we have Chandrima. You can unmute yourself and ask the question. Chandrima.
So, Professor, as you told that poverty is something that is very common with people who are very prone to it. So, Western countries and the other part of the world share a very casual relationship when we see the poverty side to it. So, do you think that the people who are more prone to poverty want that life, like choose that life because so that they can at least have a better life at the end of the day? So they rather try to get oppressed than gets nothing.
Yeah, I didn't fully understand the question. Are poor people better off accepting? Say it again.
Yeah, my question is that if poor people are better accepting what they are getting, even if that is oppression, rather than denial from the society.
Rather than denial from the society? What does that mean?
Chandrima, I think you can type a question in the chat box for better comprehension. Till then, we'll move forward and I'll give the platform to Jal. You can unmute and ask your question.
Good evening, Professor. I am Trivedi Jal from Ties Foundation. So, sir, my question is that amidst ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, Ukraine and the European Union are actively seeking to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Russia. So, sir, given your work on global justice and institutional reform, how do you view the moral legitimacy versus practical efficacy of such a tribunal? Furthermore, how can international institutions ensure a justice that is to be that is seen to be done during an active conflict without appearing as mere victor's justice or being hindered by current jurisdictional limitations of the ICC? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think the danger of victor's justice is quite real, and I have significant sympathy for the Russian position, I have to say, in this conflict, because Russia really has been cheated, if you like. They had been made quite significant and explicit promises that NATO would not encroach into the Eastern European theater, and it has encroached further and further. And of course, the US has very much supported Ukraine membership in NATO. And that was something that I think alerted Russia to the fact that they were in this downward spiral that I mentioned, right? Russia is caught in the same modus vivendi that I analyzed in the beginning of my lecture. And they felt that if we make even this further concession and allow Ukraine to enter NATO, this will just be opening the door to even further additional concessions. We will be completely sidelined. We will be economically sidelined, politically sidelined. And so it is in our best interest here to draw a line and to say this far and no further. We have accepted all of Eastern Europe joining NATO, but we are not going to accept that with regard to the Ukraine. The additional thing, of course, was that the Ukraine canceled the autonomy of the eastern provinces, oblasts, and these oblasts are ones in which the population was predominantly Russian. And so there was a military effort to subdue that population on the part of the Ukrainians, and the Russians felt that they had a kind of human rights-based reason to try to protect this population. So I'm not saying that the Russians did the right thing in choosing violence here, but it is pretty clear that the Americans wanted this war to happen. And on the very day on which the Russians invaded, there was a meeting scheduled between Blinken and Lavrov, the two foreign ministers, and the Americans simply canceled that meeting. They said, this meeting will not take place. And at that point, the Russians then invaded. They said, okay, if we have nobody to talk to, we will just have to get in there. Again, if you look at it in terms of the analysis that I presented, this is a very nice war for the United States. It's a war where they don't have their own soldiers at risk, but where the Europeans, whom the US wants to keep in a position of subordination and support, the Europeans are very palpably reminded who is their military guarantor, right? The war serves to tell the Europeans that really, when push comes to shove, when you are confronted by the Russian military, you need us. We are the ones with the big stick. We are the only ones who can deliver the weapons that you need, who can protect you in an emergency. And so it made the Europeans, again, much more subservient to the US than they might otherwise be. So in that sense, again, this is very explainable, very understandable from the point of view of the US, that they wanted this war to happen. And what I think the Europeans should do is to try to end this war, not by making demands that would be very difficult for the Russians to meet, but rather through diplomacy, to finding an end, pressuring also Zelensky to some extent to accept a resolution of the war that concedes territory. Of course, that is the only way this is going to end, but is not sort of pulling out the big guns and say that we need to find one party guilty or something like that, but rather try to find a diplomatic solution. And that would also be very much in the interest of all these people, millions of people who are hurt by this war. The war has created enormous amount of suffering, both on the Ukrainian side and also on the Russian side. Lots and lots and lots of young people your age being put into the meat grinder. And that itself is a horror that we should want to end as soon as possible.
Thank you so much for that wonderful question, Jal, and sir for that answer. Moving ahead, I would like to call upon Jaydev for the next question.
Thank you, sir, for a wonderful lecture. Sir, as you have told that this modest vivendi for the other nations, like Africa, because of the UN aid has been continuously been, they're removing the UN aid from many countries of the Africa. And in the context of that, I want to ask that the China is continuously investing in Africa. In the African context, how do mechanisms like resource extraction, debt structure, and illicit financial flows reinforce the global poverty trap? Like they are being the investment is there, but the poverty is not going.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
how
very
you look in this situation? Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So again, China is heavily investing in these countries, and of course, China is very much aware of the analysis that I presented, the standard Western analysis of power and geopolitics. And the Chinese leadership is very scared, right? They are in a situation where they fear that there is a real possibility of a third world war that they might be drawn into. They see the Americans as understanding the situation. There is a power that is becoming stronger and stronger. China is now, in terms of purchasing power parity, as large an economy, even a larger economy than the United States. And so the Chinese are very nervous about the nervousness of the United States, right? They see the United States as being very nervous about the emergence of this peer competitor. And they fear that the US will, and I think with very good reason, that the US will do everything and anything in its power to make China small again. That is the subtext of Make America Great Again, is make China small again, right? And how do you make China small again? Well, one way you can do that is to subvert the leadership. That is a real possibility. In the moment, this is difficult. Xi Jinping is very well established and so on, but next time a new leader is needed in China, Xi Jinping will not live forever. The Americans will certainly make an effort to try to put their man in power if they can, or to create some sort of trouble domestically. But the biggest strategy that the Americans can pursue against China is the strategy of subversion. That is to say, subverting other countries. So the US is basically turning around the allies of China, countries like Venezuela, Iran, and so on, that were friendly to China. And those countries you can subvert, you can change their leadership in order to deny China access to resources. And if you control China's oil supply, for example, or if you control their trade with other countries in such a way that you can turn off that trade at your pleasure, then of course you can thereby keep China down or keep it dependent and exercise power over China. This is very much something that China understands, and so China is very actively trying to create lots of trading relations, which are not, even if we lose our trade with Venezuela or with Iran, because the Americans are managing to overthrow the government there, we still have many other trading partners left, right? China is dependent on importing resources, for example, from Africa, and it needs to establish these trading relationships. So, and you're completely right that the large investment that China has made in Africa has not been made with the main intent to help Africa overcome poverty. The main intent is to secure its own standing. China wants to survive and wants to ensure that it has trading partners and access to raw materials and so on and so forth. But it has done some good for some African countries, though I would say one big mistake that China has made, also strategically, is to deal too much with the established governments. In Africa, the common situation is that you have old men who have long passed their shelf life, running countries, presiding over countries, often undemocratically, when the country has an average age of 17 or 18, right, and they're governed by these dinosaurs from the previous century who have been in power for decades. And China has, under the title of being not interfering in the internal affairs of other countries, has heavily focused its relationship on dealing with the leaders of these countries. And that, I think, is a big mistake. China is interfering in these countries and is very often strengthening the established and very unpopular leaders of those countries. I mean, people like Mussolini and so on, who are just dreadful creatures who should long have died or disappeared. And so what China should be doing is, of course, China needs to look for resources, secure its trading routes, and so on and so forth. But China should also be aware that these people will not, these leaders will not last forever, and that it needs to do more to help the actual rank and file population of these countries and help build infrastructure and support development that actually will benefit the largely youthful populations of these African countries.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jaydev, for that question, and it was really an insightful answer, sir. Now we would like to give the floor to Satyanarayan. Satyanarayan Tushar, you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes. So my question is about your presentation on power. You mentioned about the power of the economic power, military power, and the soft power. I think in a realistic world, the idealistic thought doesn't have any place. For example, soft power in international politics. As of now, everything is going smooth and good. When a lunatic leader like Trump comes into power, the soft power doesn't have any role over military and economic power. So it is the power of a weak country, I think, to push forward to the global form. What is your idea on this? And my second question is, uh, what is your thought about democratic setup of governance and the communist form of governance? As I put an example of China and in India, a state of Kerala, which have high literacy rate, zero poverty, and they achieved even the SDG goal. So, if a communist thought or communist idea have such kind of power, then why should we be kept under circumstances of the democratic idea? What is your thought? This is my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, so with regard to soft power, so I would not say that soft power is irrelevant. Soft power is definitely not irrelevant, though it is, it is under great threat in the sense, of course, people, countries and states pay a lot of attention to soft power. They try to justify what they're doing, and they now with AI and with social media, they are trying very hard to present themselves in a positive light and to mobilize support. But there is a countervailing factor, which is that they also are trying to indicate to the world that they are unconstrained in the use of military power. So this was very clear. We had a debate here where 6 congressmen of the United States issued a statement, and they said that servicemen, military personnel in the US should be reminded of the fact that they can refuse illegal orders. And immediately the Trump administration said these people should be prosecuted for treason. They should be prosecuted for treason for reminding the military that they. So uh, the uh, the idea is that yes, we want to present ourselves in a positive light. We do not give up the dimension of soft power. We spend a lot of effort to try to present ourselves in a good light, but this has to be always consistent with unconstrained use of our military and economic power. And these two things are compatible simply by telling the story that I told at the beginning, namely that we say that we are very deeply moral, we are deeply committed to human rights, to democracy, and so on. But unfortunately, we cannot afford to live up to these commitments at the present because we are living in this terrible world where we are threatened by the Chinese. And the Chinese are power seekers. They are not committed to human rights and to democracy. They go to Africa to try to exploit people and so on. And so in this dog eats dog world, in this jungle, unfortunately, we cannot live up to our values. We have to do the kinds of things that we don't like to do, namely use our power brutally and unconstrainedly in order to save the future of the world, in order to save the world, basically. So that's uh, the way in which I think the soft power debate now goes. So soft power is important, and you are spending a lot of effort trying to win over different constituencies, make people friendly to your country and to its policies, but you make sure that this does not seriously constrain your policies. Now, with regard to democracy, I've traveled quite a bit in Kerala, so I am quite familiar with that particular state of India. And it is indeed very impressive there. And so obviously, I am strongly in favor of democratic institutions. Democratic institutions are in decline, very seriously in decline, and in particular because democracy is becoming ever more fragile, right? And so AI, I think, is a significant threat to it. And we have more and more institutions that are democratic in name only. People do vote. And so in that sense, we have, formally speaking, a democracy. But voters are being manipulated. In particular, the mechanism of parties is highly manipulative in the sense that voters, of course, don't choose in a vacuum. They choose from an agenda, and they, in the United States, for example, we have two political parties. There is no third party. There is no possibility of a third party because of the winner takes all constituents. And so you have the big corporations and big donors deciding who are the leaders and the candidates put up by these two parties. And what the voters in the end do is they make a choice between two different, you get a choice between Trump and Harris. And that's not much of a choice, if you ask me. So in that sense, you might say that there isn't a lot of democracy in the US. So when you ask the question of democracy, you have to look at how substantive the democracy really is, how much of an opportunity people have to mobilize, to put things on the political agenda, to raise issues, and to shape the debates that then decide the elections. And that is probably a lot better in Kerala than it is in the United States, but I think it is everywhere under threat as the opportunities for manipulation become ever more sophisticated. What is new with AI is the possibility of personalizing manipulation, right? You can now instead of manipulating messages that you send to a whole population, you have to send out the same message to everyone. You now have the opportunity to personalize messages. You send different messages to different constituents, even down to the level of individuals. And you can thereby really fine-tune the messages to the point where you can manipulate individual people's opinions and political beliefs and attitudes. And I see that as a very major threat to any genuine democracy. So I think that we are also in this regard approaching dangerous times for the survival of democracy.
Thank you for that elaborative answer, sir, and Satyanarayan for this question. Moving ahead, I would like to invite Oshin Seth for the next question.
Thank you for the brilliant session, Professor. It was quite thought-provoking and insightful. Since you were talking about the Global South, and as a student of political science myself, I have taken immense interest in this theme, during which I came across the concept of resource privilege, which is interpreted as the legal power of authoritarian rulers to be able to sell a country's natural resources to Western nations, which often fuels corruption, poverty, which is typically structural in nature. And this highlights the essential exploitation of the global south, as you were mentioning. My question to you is, as the world today races to secure critical minerals of the new age, be it semiconductors, be it green energy, be it supply chains, how can developing nations prevent this new era, which is characterized by structural exploitation, and ensure that the resources that they possess essentially benefit them and translate into genuine domestic development for the developing nations itself, with a particular reference to the global south? Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful question, and thank you for that. And that is another example of the way in which our economic order today, our global economic order, is structured in a way that benefits big corporations and billionaires at the expense of the poor. So this would have been another example that I would have discussed if there had been more time. So the resource privilege is basically, it's an international rule that is not even very clearly formulated, but is honored in practice, which says that any person or group exercising power in a country is entitled to confer legally valid ownership rights in natural resources to anyone they choose. So if you have a dictator in Africa who has pushed his way into power, some general or something, that person is recognized everywhere in the world as having the legal authority to sign away resources of his country to anybody he likes. This is a wonderfully convenient rule for corporations in the global north, because they can buy resources from anybody, regardless of how they came to power, regardless of how they exercise power. They can acquire legal title to resources. But of course, it's a catastrophically bad rule for the people of the country, because A, they lose their resources, and B, they strengthen the dictator. The guy who is oppressing them now gets all this money in addition that he can use to buy the soldiers and weapons that he needs to keep himself in power. So it's a horrible, horrible rule. And it is something that can be overturned really only through the collective action of the developing countries. So this is something that would have to be done, I think, in the context of the African Union. The African Union could do two things. It could say that we want to establish minimal legitimacy criteria, and we agree on those. We will basically agree to put the world on notice that only governments, only rulers who are minimally legitimate through democratic elections that are certified by the African Union only those rulers shall be deemed entitled to sell the resources of their country. And secondly, all these resource sales must go through a central auction house that is organized within the African Union to ensure that we get competitive prices for the resources. What is now happening is that a lot of the resources that are sold out of Africa are sold at prices that are much too low, directly or indirectly. This happens, for example, a country says, okay, you can exploit this particular site. You can take as much cobalt or as much oil from this site as you wish, and you pay a fee for that. And that fee is grotesquely low, right? The companies get enormous amount of resources extracted from the site that is completely out of proportion to the fee that they're paying. How does that happen? Well, it happens because the company pays some additional kickback under the table to the decision makers, the minister for oil in Nigeria, for example, and that kickback ensures that they get these very favorable terms. If we had a systematic sort of an auction house where all the resources are auctioned off, where competing bids are being received, then we would ensure that the resources at least are sold at competitive prices. And that would also ensure transparency, that the population of a country would know this is the amount of money that we got into our national budget as a result of this particular resource sale. And our government better account for how they spent that money, because that is money, our money, that was received for the sale of our resources. So the solution is quite easily sketched. You know, we need these two elements, but it is very difficult to implement because, of course, many of the existing rulers in Africa are also very happy with the existing system. They're very happy to see the resources of their country sold much too cheaply to foreigners, because they personally get a kickback for themselves and for their families and for their cronies. And so they're acting dramatically against the interests of their own populations. They're selling out, basically, their populations for a rather small personal benefit that they receive.
Thank you so much for that question, Oshin, and sir for that answer. Moving ahead, I would like to call Alicia Idrisi to ask a question. And I would request to keep the questions concise since we are facing a time constraint. Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening, sir. Sir, actually, my question is little longer, but I'll still try that I do not do it, make it bigger. So, sir, in your lecture, you have mentioned that there are these powerful countries which sideline the morality, the ethical principle of all the nations. So we are witnessing very clearly in the conflict between Israel and people of Gaza, where innocent civilians, especially children, are facing starvation. My first question is ki, when deprivation of food is intentional and structurally imposed, does it still fall within the definition of poverty? Or should it be understood as a form of engineered injustice? Secondly, my another important question is, as so-called civilized global community, where exactly are we heading when civilians are kept like civilians are starving, and what then is the practical relevance of international humanitarian law? And similarly, what is the relevance of United Nations in such a crisis when a single veto can override collective moral consensus? And finally, how meaningful sustainable development goal exist when we have goal 2? I'm asking this question because I myself belong from lawyers, like I'm law student. Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, Gaza is a catastrophe not only in terms of humanity or humanitarian considerations, but it's a moral catastrophe. It's an incredible setback. That something like this can happen in the 21st century is a scandal, right? And I don't care whether you call what people are experiencing in Gaza, of course, you can call it poverty. They are deprived of the essentials of survival of human life. But of course, it's engineered poverty. It's poverty that is imposed through the blockade. And these people are being murdered, massively murdered by a state. And it is absolutely incredible what's going on. It's incredible that countries like the United States, but also my home country of Germany, they are fully supporting that. And they are taking extraordinary measures to suppress any kind of criticism of Israel's policies. You know, this is anti-Semitic to say that Israel is doing anything wrong in Gaza. I mean, this is a classic example of a genocide that is happening there. And you know, everybody who is a genocide expert, Israeli genocide experts, people who have studied the genocide that the Germans committed against the Jews, everybody is agreeing on that, right? It's a very plain and obvious case. And so I don't know how much more clearly I can say that this is a dramatic setback. I see it in the context of what I said about the paper tiger thing, right? That the competition between the US and China is heating up. The US is highly nervous about China, or at least pretends to be, and it sees the challenge of China as an opportunity to pull out all the moral stops, right? Morality is nice for philosophy seminars, but in the real world, please spare us. We cannot deal with this now. We are in a life and death situation. We have to fear the Chinese. And so we have to pull out all the stops, and we have to, you know, we can't allow our companies to be taxed abroad. We cannot allow this and that and the other. So this is exactly what the big corporations want. They want to be unleashed. They want to be unregulated. They want to be able to do whatever they want to do anywhere in the world with the full support of the US government. And so for them, this complete unleashing, this complete disregard of moral rules is part of the plan. And so Gaza demonstrates that. You demonstrate to the world, look, this is what we can do. We can kill women and children massively, and nobody will say anything. We can get away with that. And that gives you additional political power, because you demonstrate to the world that not only do we have the bombs and the AI programs to use the bombs to engage in this massive genocidal killing, but we can actually politically do it. We can manufacture the consent that we need to get away with this. And that is the the way in which the US and the constituents that use the US government in order to further their ends and to increase their power, demonstrate to the world, this is how powerful we are. This is what we can do. So there is a method to that madness. It's not just fortuitously, you know, why do they kill so many children? There's no point to it. But yes, there is a point, and the point is to show that this is what we are, not a paper tiger. We can do whatever we want. And this is, I think, a message also to China. You know, can you do this? Can you do this? Can you kill women and children like we do? You wouldn't have the nerve, you wouldn't have the support in your local population. You just couldn't do it. So sad and actually horrifying, but this is what Western civilization has come to.
Thank you, Alicia, for that question, and sir for that intriguing answer. It certainly leaves a food for thought for everyone. Since we are facing time constraint, I would now like to take the session to our conclusion. I would now, we cannot accommodate all the questions, so we apologize for that. But moving ahead, I would now like to hand over the platform to my colleague, Mr. Devesh, for delivering the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone.
Yes. Devesh, are you here? Okay, I think till that time we can accommodate one more question probably. So, if anyone at all has a short question, maybe you all can ask. Disha?
Yes. Good evening, Professor. My name is Dasha Tyagi. I had a question regarding, as you mentioned about the powers, traditional form of powers like military, economic, and soft power. Now there's a growing importance of like critical resources like energy, water, rare earth minerals. So, like, is there any chance of the all these resource like energy and all to replace or add on to the list of powers?
Well, I would say we don't need to add them to the list of powers. I think they are included in economic power and also in the what I call the subversion power already. So economic power, of course, is important because if you have money, you can buy resources, but not always, because China has a lot of money, but it may be cut off from resources, for example, by the US Navy or by governments that are trading with China being overthrown and prevented from trading with China, right? Venezuela, for example, the US may dictate to Venezuela or to a future Iranian government, you can no longer sell oil to China. So resources are crucially important. You're totally right about that. But I would think that the power that they represent, that they give, and that control over these resources confers on agents, that power is already accounted for under the economic category and under the subversion category, where you, by subverting governments that are potential trading partners with your adversaries, you can cut those adversaries off from crucial resources. So I don't think we need a fifth dimension of power in order to accommodate this important point that you were mentioning.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for everyone's cooperation. We have Devesh with us for the vote of thanks. Devesh, are you in the meet?
Hello.
Yes, you're on. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. As we draw this enriching webinar to a close, it's my privilege and honor to express our heartfelt gratitude on behalf of entire TIES family. First and foremost, we extend our deepest thanks to our distinguished guest of honor, our speaker, Professor Thomas POGGE. Professor, your ability to provide insights on world poverty and politics by distilling complex normative frameworks into actionable policy recommendations is truly rare. And we are immensely grateful that you choose to share your time, expertise, and perspectives with us today. For our audience, from students, researchers, policymakers, and fellow young thinkers joining us today from across India and the world. Thank you for your enthusiastic participation. A special word of appreciation for our moderator Damini. Our heartfelt thanks to our entire organizing team. You are the backbone of everything we do here. And a special thanks to our co-founders Hardik and Prithvi for building a platform where conversations like these are not only possible but celebrated. Professor POGGE, we hope this is not the last time TIES has the privilege of engaging with you. The questions you have raised today are questions that the next generation of policymakers, researchers, and citizens in this room will carry forward. At TIES, we believe that ideas have the power to change the world. And today, you have given us no shortage of powerful ideas. On this note, this session stands officially concluded. The recording of today's webinar will be made available on our platforms. Please do follow us on our social media handles and stay connected for upcoming events. Thank you once again. The links are in the chat box. Do join us again. Thank you once again. Jai.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Devesh. We have put the link for a feedback form in the chat box. We would highly appreciate you all filling it up so that we know your valued thoughts about our session. Thank you so much.